Welcome to Dark History for Sleep. Tonight we step into a world of lacquered wood, flickering lantern light, and the sound of shamisen strings drifting into the night air. A world built on grace, artistry, and chains you cannot see. To understand the life of a geisha, we must first strip away the illusions. In the West, the word geisha often summons a picture of exotic beauty, a woman in ornate silk, smiling beneath a painted face. But the true story, rooted in the rigid society of Edo period Japan, was far more complex and far less romantic. The geisha profession was born in the 17th century in a Japan that was closed to much of the outside world. It was a society ordered by class, duty, and reputation. The shogunate ruled with strict laws. Merchants built fortunes in the growing cities, and entertainment districts flourished as tightly regulated escapes from the everyday. It was in these districts, places like Kyoto's Gion and Tokyo's Yoshiwara, that geisha culture emerged. Here, artistry was both a performance and a livelihood, and women trained from childhood to perfect skills in music, dance, poetry, and conversation. They were not just entertainers, but masters of the subtle social dance between client and performer. Yet behind the silk screens and polished manners, many lived under contracts that were little different from bondage. Some were sold into okiya, geisha houses, by families too poor to keep them fed. Others entered willingly, drawn by the promise of prestige, only to discover the steep cost of that path. Years of debt, constant scrutiny, and the loss of personal freedom. This is not the story of a glamorous profession. It is the story of a life lived under layers of silk and rules, where every smile was rehearsed, every gesture calculated, and every mistake costly. The okiya geisha house was both home and cage. For a child brought to its doors, the world beyond the wooden threshold would fade like a forgotten dream. Most entered as young as 7 or 8, though some came later. In Edo period Japan, poverty could be relentless. A father drowning in debt, a mother unable to feed her children. An okiya's offer could seem like salvation. The geisha mistress, or okami-san, promised food, shelter, and a future. But that promise came with invisible chains. Every kimono, every lesson, every meal was a debt to be repaid. The first days were bewildering. The air inside the okiya smelled of sandalwood and rice powder. The rooms were quiet, but alive with the soft padding of slippered feet. The young girl was not yet a geisha. She was a servant in training, an atotori, tasked with cleaning rooms, fetching tea, and silently observing the older women at work. Her name would change. Her hair would be cut or styled according to her station. Her family name might never be spoken again within those walls. From now on, she belonged to the house. Training began at once. She learned to bow properly, back straight, eyes down, hands folded just so. She practiced walking without letting her kimono hem touch the ground. She sat through hours of posture drills, learning to appear effortless while her muscles burned. And above all, she watched. Every smile from a senior geisha, every turn of the wrist when pouring sake, every pause before speaking. It was all part of the language she would have to master. But before she could become an apprentice maiko, there was still a long road ahead, one paved with discipline, obedience, and the quiet erasure of self. The path from servant to maiko, an apprentice geisha, was not marked by ceremony so much as survival. Only the girls who endured the discipline, the endless corrections, and the emotional isolation would advance. In the mornings, the house filled with the sound of Okami-san paid for every teacher, and every coin she spent became another thread in the web of debt binding the girl to the Okiya. The training was exacting. Music required precise finger placement, every note clean and deliberate. Dance demanded the control to turn slowly on socked feet without disturbing a single fold of the kimono. Speech was polished until even a simple "good evening" carried the correct tone and pause. Mistakes were met with gentle correction in public and sharper words behind closed doors. A clumsy pour of tea could bring a lecture on grace. A moment of hesitation in conversation could mean an evening spent rehearsing answers in front of a mirror. The older geisha were both mentors and judges. They might offer advice one day, then test her the next with a subtle challenge. A question about history, a request for a poem, a sudden, deliberate silence she had to fill with wit or charm. All the while, her personal life narrowed. Friends outside the district drifted away. Family visits became rare. Her hair, her clothing, her very mannerisms were no longer her own. They belonged to the role she was being shaped to play. And when the Okami-san judged her ready, she would take the step that would define her life. Her debut as a maiko, where every eye in the room would be watching. Kyoto's entertainment district was called the Karyukai, the Willow World. It was a name that carried both beauty and warning. Willows bent with the wind, graceful and enduring, but rooted in place. On the night of her debut, the young maiko was transformed. Her hair, styled into a complex knot, was decorated with lacquered combs and dangling ornaments. Her face was painted with the distinctive white foundation, red lips, and black-lined eyes. A crimson collar peeked from beneath the layers of silk, a sign of her apprentice status. The kimono she wore was worth more than her family had likely ever owned. Its long, trailing sleeves brushed the tatami floors as she walked. The obi, the wide sash at her waist, was tied in an elaborate knot that hung low at her back, signaling youth and availability for conversation and company. It was beautiful and heavy enough to make breathing a conscious act. Her first night was a series of introductions. Escorted by her Oni-san, her senior older sister in the profession, she bowed at each tea house, greeting patrons and owners. Each bow had to be identical, low enough to show respect, but never so deep as to seem servile. Inside, she observed the rituals she had practiced for months, pouring sake for a guest, always with two hands, serving tea without letting the pot's spout face directly at anyone, a subtle gesture of courtesy, smiling even when the conversation was tedious or the guest's manner was sharp. The clients were often men of influence, merchants, politicians, scholars, drawn to the refined atmosphere as much as the entertainment. To them, she was a curiosity, a performer, a piece of living art. To her, they were an audience she could never afford to disappoint. By the end of the night, her feet ached from hours of walking in wooden okobo sandals. Her back throbbed from the weight of the kimono and the posture she was forced to maintain. But she smiled through the pain, because in the Willow World, appearance was everything, and the mask could never slip. Behind the polished grace of the geisha house was another world, a quieter, sharper one. It lived in whispers behind sliding doors, in glances exchanged across tea rooms, in the subtle battles fought without a single raised voice. The Okiya was a hierarchy. At the top stood the Okami-san, the house mother. Her word was law. Beneath her were the senior geisha, women with years of reputation, clients, and influence. Below them came the apprentices, ranked by age, skill, and earning potential. A young Maiko was both the pride of her house and a potential threat to older geisha. Her youth, her novelty, her ability to attract clients, all could shift the delicate balance of attention and income. And in a profession where relationships were currency, jealousy was never far from the surface. Rivalries often hid beneath layers of courtesy. A senior might forget to pass along an invitation from a wealthy patron. An apprentice might be given last choice of kimono for an important engagement. Rumors, carefully planted and softly spoken, could tarnish a reputation without leaving fingerprints. The Okami-san played her own part in this dance. Her loyalty was not to any one geisha, but to the prosperity of the house. If one woman's popularity began to fade, the mistress might shift her support to a rising star, pairing her with valuable clients and pushing her forward in the district's social scene. Every evening, the house came alive with preparations, faces painted, hair adjusted, silk smoothed. But beneath the soft rustle of fabric was the sound of ambition. Each woman stepping out into the night to secure her place in a world that offered beauty, but no security. In the Willow World, beauty and skill were only part of survival. The true currency was connection, ties to patrons who could keep a geisha in work, in fine clothing, and in the good graces of the district. A danna, a patron, was more than just a regular client. He was a sponsor. He might cover the cost of her kimono, her training, or the debt she owed to the Okiya. In return, she offered him her company at banquets, her performances at private gatherings, and the prestige of being associated with a celebrated figure. But patronage was a dangerous balance. Rely too heavily on one man, and a geisha risked losing her independence, offend him, or lose his interest, and she could find herself without the resources to keep her career alive. For a Maiko, the first approach from a potential patron was a turning point. It might come through the Okami-san, or through an older geisha acting as a go-between. The terms were rarely written down, but they were understood. Gifts would be given, favors returned, and loyalty expected. Some patrons were generous, using their influence to introduce their geisha to new circles of wealthy guests. Others were possessive, limiting her appearances to their own events and quietly isolating her from other clients. A skilled geisha navigated these waters with care, accepting the benefits without becoming trapped by them. But for a young Maiko, still finding her footing, a powerful patron could be both a lifeline and a leash. In the end, every relationship was a negotiation, and every evening spent with a patron was another move in a game where the stakes were a woman's future. The banquet hall glowed with lantern light, the air warm with the mingled scents of grilled fish, sweet sack, and sandalwood incense. For the guests, this was a night of luxury. For the geisha, it was a stage, and every movement, every word, was part of the performance. The room's center was not marked by a head table or podium, but by the guests whose wealth and influence demanded attention. A skilled geisha could spot them instantly. The man whose cup was always full, the merchant whose laughter made others lean in, the quiet official whose approval was worth more than gold. She entered silently, bowing first to the host, then to each guest in turn. Her eyes scanned the table without lingering, reading the mood, the alliances, the rivalries. A banquet was as much about who spoke to whom as it was about the food. Serving was an art in itself. She poured sake without a drop spilled, refilled cups before they were empty, and placed each dish with a precision that suggested effortless grace. The truth was, her mind was working constantly, remembering preferences, gauging reactions, steering conversations away from dangerous topics. When music began, she shifted seamlessly from servant to performer. The shamisen rested against her shoulder as her fingers moved with practiced ease, filling the room with clear, haunting notes. Her voice joined the music, weaving old songs of love, loss, and longing, tales that carried more weight than the listeners might admit. Yet the performance didn't end when the song did. The real work began in the quiet moments between courses, in the light laughter at a clever remark, in the gentle touch of a hand as she poured another drink. Every gesture was an invitation, never too forward, never too distant. By the end of the night, the guests left feeling seen, valued, and entertained. That was the unspoken contract. They would remember her name, and in return, she would remember theirs. When the lanterns dimmed and the laughter faded, the glamour of the evening dissolved into silence. The streets of the district, lively just hours before, now echoed only with the distant click of wooden sandals on stone. For the guests, the night ended in satisfaction and rest. For the geisha, it ended in exhaustion. The obi came untied slowly, layer by layer, revealing the toll of hours spent standing, bowing, and walking under the weight of silk and expectation. A full formal kimono could weigh more than 20 pounds. The heavy fabrics pressed into her shoulders, the tightly bound waist restricted her breathing, and the elaborate hairstyle pulled at her scalp until it ached. By the time she returned to the okiya, even sitting down could bring a wave of relief. The physical strain was matched by mental fatigue. Every conversation of the night had been a calculation, balancing charm and deference, wit and restraint. One careless word could sour a relationship. One forgotten name could close a door forever. Rest was rare. Early the next morning, she would rise to prepare for another day, lessons in music and dance, household chores, and more appearances at tea houses or banquets. The profession demanded constant perfection, and there was no such thing as calling in sick. Pain, when it came, was endured quietly. Sore muscles, blisters from sandals, headaches from hair ornaments. These were simply part of the job. A geisha's duty was to be graceful, even when her body screamed otherwise. The mask of beauty had to remain unbroken, because in the Willow World, to show the strain was to risk the illusion. And without the illusion, there was nothing left to sell. Beyond the tea houses and lantern-lit streets, the geisha existed in a strange space between fascination and judgment. To some, she was a living symbol of refinement, an artist devoted to preserving Japan's traditional music, dance, and etiquette. To others, she was little more than a decoration for the wealthy, a figure whose worth was tied to her beauty and youth. In Edo period Japan, reputation was everything. Geisha were carefully separated, at least in theory, from the courtesans who worked in the licensed pleasure districts. Their art, not intimacy, was supposed to define their role. But outside the carefully maintained boundaries of the karyukai, many failed or refused to make understanding was not accidental. The mystery surrounding the geisha was part of her allure. She moved in elite circles, but her personal life was hidden behind closed screens. Rumors could swirl endlessly, adding to her intrigue, but also fueling prejudice. For women outside the profession, the geisha could inspire both admiration and resentment. Her beauty, her clothing, and her skill in conversation seemed enviable. But her freedom was an illusion, one that many who envied her would never see through. When foreigners began arriving in greater numbers during the late 19th century, the confusion deepened. Western visitors, unfamiliar with the cultural boundaries of Japan, often misinterpreted the role of geisha entirely. Some saw them as courtesans, others as exotic curiosities to be photographed and written about. This perception would have lasting consequences, changing how the world viewed geisha, and even how Japan itself chose to present them in the modern era. In the Willow World, time was an enemy no one could see, but every woman could feel. A geisha's art improved with age. Her wit sharpened, her conversation deepened, her presence became more commanding. Yet the society that admired her valued something else entirely: youth. The first signs were subtle. A once coveted Maiko might notice fewer invitations to perform. A patron's attention might shift to a newer apprentice. In a profession where demand could change with the season, each year mattered. Maintaining the image of effortless beauty became a daily battle. Makeup could hide fatigue, but not the quiet lines that formed at the corners of the eyes. Hair ornaments that once symbolized youthful freshness were replaced with subtler, more mature styles. Each change a silent acknowledgement that her days as the center of attention were numbered. The pressure to remain relevant pushed some to reinvent themselves. They might focus more on music or storytelling, cultivating skills that did not depend on appearance. Others doubled down on securing loyal patrons, ensuring that they would not be forgotten when younger faces arrived. But the unspoken truth was that the Willow World was built to favor the new over the familiar. Every generation of Maiko came with its own spark of novelty, and novelty sold well. For those who could not adapt, the decline could be swift. In the privacy of the Okiya, older geisha sometimes took on teaching roles, training the next wave of apprentices in the same discipline they had once endured. It was a way to remain in the world they had given their lives to, even as the spotlight moved on. Yet for many, the shift from celebrated performer to quiet instructor felt like a slow fading, a reminder that in the Willow World, beauty was currency, and currency always runs out. To survive as a geisha was to live within a web of rules, some written, most spoken only in the language of expectation. These laws were as binding as the silk cords that held a kimono in place, and breaking them could mean the end of a career. The first rule was loyalty to the Okiya. A geisha was not a free agent. She was tied to her house through debt and obligation. Any earnings she made went first to the Okami-san, who decided how much, if any, she could keep. The second rule was the preservation of face, mensu. Humiliation, scandal, or public loss of composure could tarnish the entire house's reputation. A geisha learned early to endure insults with a smile, to mask exhaustion, and to respond to rudeness with subtle grace. The third rule was discretion. What was said in the tea house stayed in the tea house. Patrons trusted Geisha with conversations that might damage them if repeated. Business deals, political alliances, even personal confessions. A Geisha who betrayed that trust would find her invitations vanish overnight. The fourth rule was mastery of art. Dance, music, poetry, and tea ceremony were not side skills. They were the foundation of her worth. Falling behind in practice meant risking being outshone, and in a profession that thrived on competition, that was dangerous. There were softer, unspoken rules as well. Never outshine your senior unless she allows it. Never let jealousy show. Never betray the sisterhood of your house in public, no matter the private tensions. These rules did not merely shape behavior, they shaped identity. A Geisha's sense of self was molded to fit the expectations of her world, until it became second nature to put the profession before personal desires. Rules gave the Willow World its elegance, its sense of order. But in the wrong hands, those same rules could tighten into chains, subtle instruments of control disguised as tradition. The debt to the Okiya was the strongest link in that chain. It covered training, kimonos, hair ornaments, even the cost of daily meals. The more a Geisha worked, the more she could pay it down. Yet the expenses of her profession ensured that the ledger was rarely cleared. A new set of formal robes, a trip to a distant performance, a celebration hosted for a patron, all added to the balance. This debt gave the Okami-san extraordinary power. If a Geisha angered her, she could withhold prime engagements, pairing her instead with low-paying clients or excluding her from major events. Opportunities were not given equally. They were tools, and they could be used to reward obedience or punish dissent. Rivalries within the house could be stoked by the same system. If two women vied for the same patron, subtle favoritism from the mistress could tilt the competition. A whispered warning, a convenient mistake in scheduling. These could shift a career's trajectory without leaving any visible trace. The social rules of the district added another layer of control. Breaking an unspoken law, appearing too forward with a guest, showing displeasure too openly, could lead to quiet blacklisting. A Geisha might never be told why her invitations dried up, only that her calendar had grown empty. And perhaps the cruelest aspect of all was that many of these rules were enforced not by outsiders, but by the women themselves. Years of training instilled them so deeply that even when no one was watching, a Geisha would keep her posture perfect, her voice measured, her mask in place. In this way, the Willow World was self-policing, its elegance built on invisible restraints, its beauty maintained by those it quietly bound. In the Willow World, the year did not simply pass. It unfolded in a series of performances, ceremonies, and unspoken opportunities. Each season carried its own duties, its own costumes, and its own subtle changes in a Geisha's fortunes. Spring was a time of renewal and display. The cherry blossoms drew visitors from across Japan, and with them came lavish banquets and street festivals. Geisha wore lighter, brighter silks, adorned with patterns of blossoms and flowing streams. It was the season to secure new patrons, to make introductions, and to be seen in public as much as possible. Moreover, summer brought a slower pace, but also its own challenges. The heat made the heavy layers of kimonos stifling, and the elaborate hairstyles trapped every drop of sweat. Evening gatherings became more common, held in open-air pavilions where the sound of cicadas filled the pauses in conversation. It was a season for elegance in restraint, fans used in dance, subtle shifts in posture to catch a breeze. Autumn was the season of reflection and refinement. As the maple leaves turned crimson, events became more formal. Guests expected deeper conversation, performances steeped in nostalgia, and songs that matched the melancholy beauty of the fading year. It was also a time when older geisha could shine, their maturity suiting the season's mood. Winter was the most demanding. The new year brought a flood of formal visits, each requiring the most elaborate kimono and precise etiquette. The cold was an enemy. Silk did little to ward it off. But the season was also one of the most profitable, as wealthy patrons celebrated with generous gifts and extended gatherings. The cycle repeated year after year, marking time not in birthdays or personal milestones, but in the steady rhythm of obligations and performances. For a geisha, the seasons were less about nature's beauty and more about the ever-turning wheel of work. Though the image of the geisha is often painted with the brush of Kyoto's elegance, the Willow World was never a single place. It existed in different forms across Japan, each shaped by the character of its city. Kyoto, the ancient capital, was the heart of refinement. Here, geisha embraced centuries-old traditions, slow, graceful dances, formal music, and poetry steeped in history. The Gion district was a world unto itself, with narrow stone lanes, low wooden tea houses, and the faint glow of paper lanterns. Kyoto's geisha were guardians of an art form untouched by haste, their work steeped in ceremony. Edo, modern-day Tokyo, was another matter entirely. Its entertainment districts pulsed with the restless energy of merchants, samurai, and travelers. Here the pace was faster, the performances livelier, and the competition fierce. A geisha in Edo had to be as quick with her words as with her hands, ready to amuse guests who valued wit and novelty as much as beauty. Osaka, the merchant city, offered yet another variation. Known for its wealth and business culture, its patrons were shrewd and discerning. Geisha here were expected to be skilled conversationalists, able to speak of trade, politics, and theater. The art was less about formality and more about connection, winning the favor of men who valued cleverness over ritual. Moving between these cities was rare, but stories traveled easily. Geisha in Kyoto might hear tales of Edo's brash humor, while those in Edo whispered about the serene mystery of Kyoto's women. Each city guarded its own identity, its own way of interpreting the same ancient role. Yet beneath the differences, the core of the profession remained the same: discipline, beauty, and the unspoken labor of carrying an illusion that had to be perfect, no matter the city in which it was performed. The life of a geisha was a performance without end, but even the finest actors could not remain in character forever. There were moments, brief, hidden, when the mask slipped. Sometimes it happened in the quiet after a long night, when the kimono had been folded away and the makeup wiped clean. In the stillness of her small room at the Okiya, she might sit by the lamp, her hair loosened, her posture relaxed for the first time in hours. The transformation was almost startling, no longer the polished figure who had charmed a banquet, but simply a woman, tired and human. Other moments came unexpectedly. A laugh too genuine to be rehearsed, a sigh she could not hide when her feet throbbed from hours of standing. These slips were rare in public, but when they came, they revealed a truth most patrons never saw. Behind the art was a person with her own aches, her own longings, and her own private history. Yet such glimpses carried risk. The Willow World thrived on illusion, and a geisha's value was tied to the perfection of her role. To show too much of herself, her struggles, her discontent, could make the fantasy crumble. A guest who saw the fatigue in her eyes might not return. Some women guarded these private moments fiercely, keeping their inner selves locked away from everyone but their closest sisters in the Okia. Others allowed small flashes of honesty to slip through, trusting that a well-timed confession could make them seem more human and, paradoxically, more cherished, without shattering the image entirely. But the line was razor thin. Too much truth and the mask broke. Too little, and she became nothing more than a beautiful ghost moving through other people's evenings. The Willow World was built to be timeless. A place where centuries-old songs still filled the air, where lantern light glowed the same way it had for generations. But outside its narrow streets, history was moving, and no profession, no matter how steeped in tradition, could escape its reach. The first great tremor came with the arrival of the West in the mid-19th century. Foreign ships appeared in Japanese waters carrying new goods, new fashions, and new ideas. Western observers were fascinated by the geisha, but their misunderstandings of the role began to spread both abroad and at home. Then came the Meiji era. Japan was modernizing at a breakneck pace. Railways, telegraphs, and Western-style institutions reshaped the cities. Some districts adapted quickly, incorporating new music and styles into their repertoire. Others clung fiercely to the old ways, resisting any change that might erode the profession's traditions. The most profound change came with war. During the early 20th century, conflicts disrupted the flow of patrons. Men who might have once filled the tea houses were sent to battlefields. Luxury gatherings became rarer, and the opulence of the Willow World suddenly seemed out of step with a nation at war. In the post-war years, the profession had to reinvent itself. The image of the geisha shifted, no longer simply an entertainer for the elite, but also a cultural ambassador, a living emblem of traditional Japan for the eyes of a watching world. This brought new opportunities, but also further blurred the line between truth and performance. Through it all, the geisha adapted, they always had. But with each change, a little of the old world slipped away, like silk threads fraying slowly under the weight of time. Behind the sliding doors of the Okia, the Willow World became smaller, more personal, a place where the geisha were not only colleagues, but bound together in a strange sisterhood. The hierarchy was clear. At the top stood the Okami-san, the house mother, who oversaw every schedule, every debt, every introduction. Beneath her were the senior geisha, seasoned in both art and strategy. They were the role models, and sometimes the rivals. Or for the Maiko, these women were both guides and gatekeepers. An apprentice learned how to bow, how to pour sake, how to move across a tatami mat without a sound. She also learned which guests could be teased, which needed deference, and which should be avoided altogether. The bond between One-san, older sister, and Imuto-san, younger sister, was one of the most important relationships in a geisha's early career. The senior took on the role of mentor, shaping the younger's image and introducing her to patrons. In return, The apprentice mirrored her mentor's style, absorbing not just skills, but the subtle nuances that could not be taught in a classroom. But living together in close quarters, sharing the same ambitions, could strain even the strongest ties. Jealousies formed over a generous patron, a coveted performance, or praise from the Okami-san. Arguments were usually quiet, but the tension could linger for weeks. Still, when the outside world pressed in, the women of the house often closed ranks. A harsh guest, an unfair rumor, a rival district's slight. These were met with a unity that made the Okiya feel less like a boarding house and more like a fortress. Mura was a family, but one built on performance and discipline, where affection and competition lived side by side under the same paper-thin walls. For years, she had lived in the shadow of her Oni-san, absorbing every lesson, enduring every correction, her life measured in dance steps, bow angles, and carefully chosen words. Now came the night when she would step into her own name, the evening of her Erike, the turning of the collar. In the hours before, the Okiya was a flurry of movement. The white makeup was applied with care, the red and black accents painted with the same precision as a master calligrapher's strokes. Her hair, until now styled in the elaborate loops of a maiko, was arranged in the sleek, understated fashion of a full geisha. The most visible sign of the change was her collar. The red-lined collar of youth was replaced by one of pure white, a symbol of maturity, independence, and readiness to stand on her own. But the transformation was not only in appearance. For the first time, she would walk into the tea houses without the shadow of her mentor. Every bow, every word, every note of the shamisen would be hers alone to carry. The protection of apprenticeship was gone. The night was a series of formal visits. She made the rounds to the patrons who had supported her training, bowing deeply, exchanging respectful words, and accepting their congratulations. Gifts were offered, beautiful hair ornaments, new silks, envelopes with crisp bills. Yet beneath the celebration lay pressure. From this night forward, her debts were truly her own. Her success or failure would rest entirely on her ability to maintain relationships, to secure engagements, to keep her calendar full. In the quiet hours after the last guest had gone, she sat alone in her small room, the white collar still pristine against her neck. She was no longer a student. She was a geisha, and from here, there would be no turning back. In the Willow World, every geisha knew this truth. Talent and beauty could open doors, but a patron could keep them open. Adana was more than just a favored guest. He was a benefactor, a sponsor, a steady source of income and influence. His support might cover the cost of new kimonos, travel to distant performances, even contributions toward paying down the crushing debts owed to the Okiya. That for a geisha, securing a patron was both an honor and a gamble. A respected Dana could elevate her standing overnight, ensuring she was invited to the most exclusive gatherings, paired with guests whose status matched her own. But the relationship was never simple. A patron's generosity came with expectations of loyalty, availability, and sometimes unspoken personal claims. While the Willow World drew a line between geisha and courtesans, those lines blurred in the eyes of outsiders, and Adana's sense of ownership could grow quietly over time. There were patrons who treated their role as a genuine act of protection. shielding a geisha from financial instability, helping her navigate the politics of the tea house district, and expecting nothing beyond companionship and artistry. And there were others whose protection was a gilded cage. Their influence could limit her freedom to take other engagements or quietly shape her career in ways she could not refuse without risking scandal. To the outside world, the Dana system seemed like a mark of prestige. Inside the Willow World, it was understood for what it truly was: a balance of power, delicate as porcelain, beautiful when handled with care, but dangerous if ever cracked. In the public eye, a geisha's art lived in the banquet hall. It was here, under the glow of paper lanterns and the scent of fresh tatami, that reputations were made or shattered. An evening began long before the guests arrived. The geisha would meet in the okiya for final preparations, adjusting obi knots, perfecting hairstyles, checking that every fold of silk fell in place as if untouched by human hands. When the guests entered, she became the embodiment of poise. Her bow was deep but fluid, her eyes bright but never challenging. The first words mattered, set the wrong tone, and the evening could turn cold before it had even begun. The meal was its own choreography. Sake was poured with graceful precision, conversation balanced between gentle flattery and well-placed wit. If the gathering called for music, she would take up the shamisen, her fingers dancing over the strings as her voice wove the story of an old ballad. But the real performance was not the music or the dance. It was reading the room, noticing the guest whose smile was too tight, the one whose mind had drifted, and drawing them back with a perfectly timed question or playful remark. One misstep could linger in memory longer than a dozen perfect nights. A misplaced joke, an unguarded expression, a failure to respond to a guest's mood. These could spread through the district's whisper network and cost her valuable invitations. And yet, in the rare moments when everything aligned, the music flowing like water, the laughter genuine, the patrons leaving with their spirits lifted, a geisha could walk back to her okiya knowing she had not just entertained, but secured her place in the unspoken hierarchy of the Willow World. Among all the tools of her trade, none was more symbolic of the geisha than the shamisen. Its 3 strings were more than just a means to make music. They were a daily test of patience, discipline, and precision. A geisha's relationship with the shamisen began in her earliest days as a maiko. The instrument was deceptively simple in appearance. A long neck, a small square body, covered with taut skin, and 3 silk or nylon strings stretched across the length. But mastery was an entirely different matter. The practice began at dawn. Each note had to be crisp, each rhythm aligned perfectly, with the beat of the Suzumi drum or the flow of a singer's voice. A single mistake in a performance could ripple outward, throwing off dancers, singers, and the mood of the entire room. The shamisen was unforgiving. Its sound carried every flaw, every hesitation of the player's hand. The geisha learned to mask her errors, not by ignoring them, but by weaving them seamlessly back into the music, a skill that mirrored her work in conversation and performance. Beyond music, the shamisen was a symbol of refinement. Its presence in a geisha's hands was a declaration. She was not a common entertainer, but a custodian of an art form that had been passed down for centuries. Yet the instrument could also be a burden. It demanded constant upkeep, its skin sensitive to humidity, its strings snapping without warning in the middle of a song. Replacing them was costly, and the Okami-san kept careful record of each expense. Still, to the audience, none of that mattered. When the shamisen's first note rang out in the quiet of a tea house, it carried not just music, but the weight of generations, and the invisible labor of the woman who played it flawlessly, no matter what it cost her in time, energy, or blood from calloused fingers. To the outsider, the Willow World seemed like a single seamless realm of music, dance, and beauty. But within its walls, lines were drawn with the precision of a calligrapher's brush. Geisha were here, other entertainers were there, and the two worlds were never meant to touch. The most important division was between the geisha and the courtesans of the pleasure quarters. Both wore beautiful silks. Both could command the attention of a room, but the purposes of their arts were different, at least in principle. Geisha were defined as practitioners of performance and conversation, their role to engage the mind and spirit rather than the body. The courtesans, meanwhile, operated within the sanctioned brothels, offering services that were both physical and contractual. In reality, the boundary was not always so clear. Guests unfamiliar with the traditions often blurred the distinction, assuming that geisha were simply another class of courtesan. This misunderstanding frustrated many in the profession, and districts worked hard to protect their reputation by enforcing strict rules of conduct. Though competition also existed with traveling entertainers, actors in the kabuki theaters, and even musicians who played in public festivals. Each group vied for the attention of wealthy patrons, and a particularly gifted performer outside the Willow World could draw away valuable clients. The rivalry was not always hostile. Sometimes geisha would attend a kabuki performance as honored guests, or exchange polite words with entertainers from other traditions. But the unspoken truth was that every smile concealed a calculation, and every introduction was weighed for its potential benefit or threat. These lines, both visible and invisible, were part of what kept the Willow World distinct. To cross them carelessly was to risk the collapse of the very image that sustained it. It began as an ordinary winter banquet, a mix of merchants, minor officials, and one wealthy newcomer whose name the Okami-san spoke with both interest and caution. The evening started smoothly. The shamisen's notes filled the room, the sake flowed, and the geisha present exchanged practiced laughter with the men who had paid for their company. But as the night wore on, the newcomer grew restless. He had been told before coming to the district that the Willow World offered every kind of pleasure. It was a misunderstanding, one born of the blurred tales that traveled between cities. When he pressed the matter, speaking of services that belonged to the courtesan quarters, the room's atmosphere shifted. The senior geisha's smile became sharper, her words still polite but now edged with warning. A fan snapped shut in her hand like a final chord. The Okami-san intervened quickly, steering the guest toward more conversation, arranging for a song to be played, and subtly signaling that his expectations would not be met here. Still, the damage was done. Within days, whispers ran through the district. Some claimed the newcomer had been turned away in disgrace. Others said the geisha had been too bold, risking offense to a man whose wealth could have benefited them all. The truth, as always, was more complicated. The Willow World had survived for centuries by holding its boundaries, but every so often a night like this reminded its women just how thin and fragile those boundaries really were. To the guests who stepped into the tea houses, the geisha seemed like living works of art. Draped in flawless silk, hair shining under the glow of lanterns, every movement refined into elegance. What they did not see was the ledger. From the day she entered the okiya, a geisha was bound by a web of expenses, training in music, dance, and etiquette. Each lesson had a cost, recorded with careful ink. Every kimono, every hair ornament, every replacement of shamisen strings was added to her debt. A single formal kimono could cost as much as a year's rent for a common laborer, and she could not wear the same one too often. Patrons expected variety, each season bringing new patterns and colors. The okami-san advanced these costs, keeping track of every coin owed. For some geisha, it would take years to repay, even with a full calendar of banquets. Debt shaped her decisions. A lucrative patron might be accepted not just for his charm, but because his support could chip away at the numbers in the ledger. Extra performances might be taken despite exhaustion, because one missed engagement meant another week under the weight of what she owed. To the outside world, her life seemed one of glamour and choice. Inside, she understood the truth. Every bow, every song, every hour in the glow of the banquet hall was also another step toward freedom from the debt that dressed her in beauty. The Willow World was never meant to be forever. Every geisha knew that the day would come when her name would no longer draw the invitations it once did. For some, the decision to retire came quietly. A few chose marriage, often to a former patron or a man met through the tea-house circles. These unions could bring stability, though they also meant stepping into a role far different from the freedom, or at least the illusion of it, that the Willow World allowed. Others left to open their own tea houses, becoming okami-san themselves, training the next generation and managing the delicate politics of the district. In this way, their influence could outlast their years in makeup and silk. Some pursued entirely new lives. They moved to cities where no one knew their stage names, took up trades, or found work in theater and music outside the strict codes of the geisha profession. These transitions could be liberating or lonely. A few, unable to leave the life behind, remained as occasional performers, appearing for special events, their presence a reminder of the district's history. They were living legends, though the role carried its own quiet melancholy. Whatever path they chose, each carried the invisible weight of the years spent in the Willow World. The discipline, the debts, the friendships, the rivalries, and the endless performance that had shaped them into something the outside world could never quite understand. Long before the geisha became the iconic figures of refined entertainment, their predecessors walked a very different path. The earliest entertainers in Japan were not women at all, but men. Taikomochi, similar to jesters or storytellers. They served the samurai elite, offering counsel, reciting poetry, and providing clever conversation at gatherings. By the 17th century, female performers began to appear in the tea-house district, blending music, dance, and wit in ways that drew patrons away from other entertainments. These women were skilled, but their profession was not yet strictly defined. Some worked alongside courtesans, their roles overlapping in the minds of guests. The term geisha began to take on its its modern meaning in the 18th century, as the profession separated itself from the pleasure quarters. District rules were tightened. Geisha were forbidden from engaging in physical services and instead elevated the arts of music, conversation, and dance. It was in this period that the Willow World truly formed, a self-contained society with its own rules, hierarchies, and traditions, designed to keep the geisha's identity distinct and respected. From these beginnings, the profession evolved into the intricate system of apprenticeship, performance, and patronage that would endure for centuries. But those early years left their mark, and the constant effort to separate the geisha's image from the courtesan's shadow would remain a defining challenge for generations to come. In the 21st century, the Willow World still exists, but its streets are quieter, its tea houses fewer, its apprentices rarer than ever before. Where once entire neighborhoods thrived on the business of banquets and performances, only a handful of districts remain active. Kyoto's Gion, Tokyo's Shimbashi, and a few others scattered across Japan. These places carry the weight of history, their lanterns glowing like embers in the dark. Fewer young women enter the profession now. The training is long, the work demanding, and the modern world offers many other paths. Those who do choose it often speak of a calling, a desire to preserve an art that is slipping away. Tourism has become both a lifeline and a challenge. Visitors from around the world come seeking the mystery of the geisha, often armed with half-truths and romanticized images. Districts have had to strike a balance between opening their doors for public events and protecting the privacy and dignity of their traditions. The modern geisha still plays the shamisen, still dances with the same precise grace, still navigates conversations with the skill of a diplomat. But she may also take language classes to speak with foreign guests, manage her own online presence, and adapt centuries-old etiquette to a faster, more impatient world. Each performance today is more than entertainment. It is an act of preservation, a declaration that the Willow World still lives, even if its branches are thinner than they once were. Kyoto's Gion district is one of the last beating hearts of the Willow World. Its narrow streets, lined with dark wooden facades and glowing lanterns, hold an atmosphere that feels untouched by time, until the quiet hum of modern life slips in from beyond the river. As evening falls, the district awakens. Tourists gather near the wooden bridges, hoping for a glimpse of a passing geisha or maiko on her way to an engagement. Some cameras flash, others simply watch, aware that what they're seeing is rare. Inside the tea houses, preparations are underway. Tatami mats are swept, seasonal flowers arranged in the alcoves, and the kitchen begins to fill with the scents of grilled fish and simmering broth. In one okiya, a senior geisha fastens her obi with practiced hands, while a younger maiko checks the placement of her hair ornaments. They exchange a few quiet words, part advice, part reassurance, before stepping into the cool night air. Their engagement tonight is a private banquet. The guests are a mix of long-standing patrons and visiting business partners. As they enter, the geisha bow deeply, the maiko following a step behind. Sake is poured, introductions made, and the performance begins. Music, conversation, subtle laughter in the glow of lantern light. Outside, the streets remain calm. From the shadows, the sounds of shamisen music drift into the air. Gion, for all its survival, exists on the edge of two worlds. One bound by centuries of tradition, the other moving forward at a speed it can't entirely ignore. She adjusts the folds of her kimono, feeling the weight settle across her shoulders. It is more than fabric. It is history, obligation, and pride stitched into every thread. To most who see her, she is an image from another age, a relic of tradition, preserved like a painting in motion. But from within, she knows she is something living, changing, adapting with every season. When she sits with her guests, she does not think of herself as a symbol. She listens. She reads the shift of expressions, the rise and fall of voices, the way one man's eyes wander toward the shamisen in the corner, while another is clearly waiting for a clever turn of conversation. It is this, the art of understanding without being told, that she believes is the true skill of the geisha. The music, the dance, the makeup, all are tools. But the essence is connection, made in the brief hours of a banquet and remembered long afterward. She knows the future is uncertain. There are fewer apprentices now, fewer patrons willing to support the life. But as long as she walks these lantern-lit streets, as long as she can place the shamisen in her lap and make it sing, she feels the Willow World will endure, at least a little longer. In recent years, the Willow World has stepped cautiously into the global spotlight, not through the smoky allure of old tales, but in carefully curated performances meant for audiences far from the tea house walls. Some geisha now travel abroad for cultural festivals. In Paris, New York, or Sydney, they appear on brightly lit stages, explaining their art before they perform it. The music and dance remain the same, but the setting shifts. No tatami mats, no sake cups, passed hand to hand, only rows of theater seats and a polite round of applause. In Japan itself, public events have become more common. Special open banquets allow small groups of outsiders to experience what was once closed to all but the initiated. The geisha guide them through games, songs, and conversation, softening the layers of formality so guests feel welcome rather than intimidated. But this openness comes with a challenge. How do you keep a tradition alive when its mystery was part of its survival? How do you teach without diluting? It is a balance every modern geisha must navigate, sharing enough to inspire respect, but holding back enough to preserve the heart of the Willow World. And so the geisha of today become translators as much as performers, carrying their centuries-old art across cultures and generations, hoping that in the exchange, neither beauty nor meaning is lost. The rain has stopped just as the lanterns are lit. Water still clings to the stones of the narrow lane, reflecting the glow as the guests arrive one by one. Inside the tea house, the air is warm and fragrant, incense mixed with the faint scent of lacquered wood. The okami-san greets each patron at the door, leading them to the low table where cups of sake wait. The geisha enter without hurry, their steps silent on the tatami. The eldest bows first, her voice calm as she greets the guests by name. The youngest Maiko follows, her eyes lowered, hands folded neatly before her. The first hour passes in conversation, light stories, gentle teasing, small games that bring laughter without embarrassment. Then the shamisen is brought forward. Its first note silences the room. The songs are old, drawn from centuries of tradition. One tells of a love that could never be, another of a warrior's return from battle met not with joy, but with quiet resignation. Between their attention making each man feel as though the night belongs to him alone. By the time the final dance ends, the rain has begun again. A soft, steady sound outside. The guests depart with slow steps, reluctant to leave the glow of the lanterns behind. For the geisha, the night is over, but its memory will live in the minds of those who were there. A glimpse of the Willow World as it has always been, and as it hopes to remain. When the last guest has bowed his farewell, and the tea house door slides shut, the performance is not yet over. Could the geisha retreat to the back rooms, where the quiet is heavier, the light softer. Here, they unwind the layers of the night. The shamisen is wiped down and placed in its case, its strings loosened to rest until the next performance. Fans are folded and tucked away, kimono sleeves carefully smoothed before the garments are returned to their silk-wrapped boxes. Conversation among the women is low and brief. They note the mood of the evening, whether a guest seemed pleased or troubled, and any small incidents that the Okami-san should know. These details, invisible to the guests, are the business of the Willow World, knowledge that shapes future nights. Only after this does the makeup begin to come off. The thick white foundation, the precise red and black lines, the delicate shading of the lips, all are removed with slow, practiced motions. Beneath the paint, the face is softer, more human, less like the living porcelain mask worn for the banquet. By the time the last hairpin is pulled free, the geisha is herself again, or at least the version of herself that exists outside the glow of the lanterns. Then comes the walk home through quiet streets. The rain has stopped. The district is still, and the Willow World sleeps until the next night's lights are lit. In a life measured by appointments and obligations, true freedom comes in small, carefully guarded pockets of time. For some geisha, these moments arrive in the quiet mornings, before lessons or fittings begin. A walk to the riverside, the sun low on the horizon, the city not yet fully awake. She might pause on a bridge to watch the water carry away fallen leaves, knowing no one will ask her to speak, to play, or to dance here. Others find freedom late at night, after the banquets are done and the streets have emptied. A brief stop at a small familiar shop to share tea with the owner. A friend from before the Willow World claimed her hours. These moments are not about grandeur. No fine silks, no elegant performances. They are the spaces where she can be simply herself, without the weight of history resting on her shoulders. Yet even in these hours, the habits of her life remain. Her posture is still straight, her words still careful, her awareness always tuned to the people around her. It is difficult to set aside the performance entirely when it has been woven into her very way of being. And so her rare freedom is quiet, fleeting but deeply valued. A reminder that even within the most carefully crafted world, a person can still hold something purely her own. There comes a night when she steps out of the tea house for the last time. No fan in her hand, no shamisen at her side, no banquet waiting beyond the paper doors. Leaving the Willow World is rarely sudden. For most, the decision builds quietly over years. A patron's support ending, a body grown weary from the long hours and heavy kimono, or the pull of another life beyond the district walls. Some departures are celebrated. A final banquet is held. Patrons and sisters in the art gather, and toasts are made to her years of service. She leaves with gifts, promises to visit, and the blessing of her Okami-san. Others slip away without ceremony. A name disappears from the appointment books, her face no longer seen on the lantern-lit streets. In time, the newcomers do not even know she was once part of the district's story. For those who remain, these departures are a reminder. The Willow World may feel eternal, but every geisha is only passing through. Some who leave never return to visit, fearing that seeing the life again will stir longing. Others come back often, watching from the shadows as the next generation carries on the art. And for the district, each departure changes it. A voice gone from the songs, a presence missing from the dances, a thread quietly pulled from the tapestry of the Willow World. Beyond the tea house walls, the geisha's image has traveled far, carried in paintings, photographs, novels, and films. But what the world sees is often a mask, polished until it bears little resemblance to the life beneath. In the West, the geisha was long mistaken for something she was not. Early travelers wrote breathless accounts that blurred her role with that of the courtesan. Their words echoed in pulp novels and exoticized postcards. This misunderstanding hardened into myth, a story repeated so often that even some in Japan began to believe it. Other portrayals, even when meant to be admiring, reduced her to an ornament, a silent beauty framed in silk, with no hint of the discipline, wit, and control her work required. Inside the Willow World, these images were met with a mix of irritation and resignation. The geisha could not stop outsiders from telling their own versions of her story, but she could control the story told within her own walls, passing down the truth to apprentices, ensuring that the core of her art would not be lost beneath layers of romantic fiction. And yet, there is a strange symmetry in it. The geisha herself is a performer of illusion, presenting a version of herself crafted for the night's guests. Perhaps it is fitting that the world beyond sees only its own reflection in her, a mirror as much as a mask. The streets are empty now. The lanterns have been dimmed, their red glow fading into the dark. Behind closed sliding doors, the tea houses rest, their tatami mats bare, their shamisen silent. In the okiya, the kimono hang in quiet rows, their colors hidden in the shadows. Hair ornaments rest in their lacquered boxes, waiting for hands that will not touch them until another night. For the women who live here, sleep comes late. Even in rest, the day's performances replay in the mind. The smiles, the conversations, the measured steps across the tatami. Tomorrow will bring another banquet, another set of faces to read, another night of balancing tradition and survival. Outside, the city moves on, its modern life only a few streets away. But within this small district, time is slow, the air thick with the scent of old wood and rain. The Willow World will awaken again. The lanterns will glow, the shamisen will sing, and somewhere a young apprentice will take her first step into a life both beautiful and